I have a little bit of a sore throat this morning, but I'll try to keep my voice up. And for those of you who can't hear me, it might make sense to come down and be a little bit closer to the front of the stage rather than back in the balcony, because I really can't speak too much louder than I am. You may have grasped, if you've been to the prior lectures that I've given, is that there is something of a common theme. And that common theme has really started out with education, because I believe that education is really the bedrock of how we build a society that is able to effectively compete in the world. And then building onto an educational system, we need, obviously, to have a political system that is responsive and responsible to helping that technocracy that I think we need to create in the future, to have a voice in policy, to be able to feel engaged in the political process, and to be able to be a much more positive force in shaping policy than simply voting in elections once every 2 or 4 years. My lecture this morning is about globalization and how we're going to compete in the world. And I say that because we are confronted with some tremendous challenges. And those challenges are and range from anything from cheap labor, which is exporting hundreds, if not thousands, of jobs from virtually every sector of our economy, to places in the world where labor is infinitely cheaper than what it is here, and with which we quite literally cannot compete. And so if we accept as a given that our future is going to be bound by the exportation of low-wage jobs, what do we do to compensate and create a viable economic system that does not rely on low-paying labor? Now, one of the sort of lessons of the growth of civilization that has always intrigued me is that if you look at how societies developed for thousands of years, they started out with the clan, the family unit, and as they grew, the common denominator of that growth was communication. Once you were able to communicate with your neighbor, the person on the other side of the hill, the person on the other side of the river, suddenly you found you had a community of interest, and you were able to build literal as well as figurative bridges that would enable us to consolidate into ever larger units until, of course, we are where we are today. But those units were constructed based upon one fundamental common denominator. And that common denominator was economics. In an agrarian society, which of course we were predominantly until the beginning of the 19th century, economics meant land. The more land you had, the greater ability you had to grow crops, and therefore the better chance you had to be able to feed your people and have a constructive society that enabled your people to expand their horizons in terms of other fields of endeavor. Now, we find ourselves in the curious position internationally where land is no longer a benefit, but is in fact a detriment. Someone once asked me, why does Japan have a bullet train? Why does France have a bullet train and the United States does not? And the answer is deceptively simple. When you have one person per acre supporting your infrastructure, as opposed to 12, 14, 16 people an acre supporting your infrastructure, obviously spreading that burden out gives you the ability to have a much more au courant infrastructure than we have the luxury of enjoying. And yet, we have an immigration policy that is antithetical to growth. As many of you, I'm sure, are aware, when you move from the middle lower class to the upper lower class to the lower middle class to the middle class, family sizes get smaller and smaller. Upward mobility, which has been the hallmark of American society, has encouraged and indeed almost demanded that in order for you to feel good about yourselves, you need to be upwardly mobile. You need to show that you have, in fact, surpassed your antecedents and have made a better place for yourselves in our world than your parents or your grandparents. Unfortunately, I think now we're finding ourselves in a situation where that is becoming less and less the case. But having said that, what has driven that process historically is the desire that we all have to create a better life for ourselves and a better life for our children. As a result, we have created a vacuum at the bottom. When people rise in the economic spectrum, there are jobs that they feel are quite literally and figuratively beneath them. And therefore, those jobs are either not filled or are filled by now illegal immigrants who have no choice but to take those jobs. Well, there's no question in anyone's mind that we have an immigration policy in the United States. And that immigration policy is a non-immigration policy. It is a policy that in effect says that we are going to be very, very restrictive in terms of who we allow to come into our borders. And as a result, like, if you'll pardon a rather poor analogy, a vacuum cleaner, it pulls into it that which is closest to it. And of course, closest to our borders are Mexico and Canada. I suggest that the Canadians are smart enough to stay where they are, but vast numbers of poor Hispanics are moving into the United States to fill the very vacuum that upward mobility has created for them.